The first episode for 2025 of the Redacted Culture Cast is one subject that we all like to discuss, but no one likes to be lectured about: terrorism. No, I jest a little bit. We're actually going to be talking about something that can be very oftentimes something much more cringeworthy, which is your EDC, your everyday carry. It's this repeating term that most of us who are of my generation have heard about time and time and time again, oftentimes with that kind of lecturing tone of talking down to somebody. But instead of doing that, and I hope to bring a little bit of refreshment to your perspective on this subject, I want to talk about a little bit on how we think about what EDC can look like or does look like in reality on our daily basis, pulling from a quote from Jordan Peterson of all people, and that is, this is a bad paraphrase, but it's take a look at something that you could do, that you would do, and motivate yourself in that direction. In other words, if we're going to look at EDC as something that is some sort of Jason Bourne level skill set development super soldier that requires training for years, days, and hours that we just don't have, I think we're setting ourselves up for a failure. Sure, we want to be the heroes of the story, but quite frankly, we know that we are not on a Hollywood set. And so we are already into 2025. We are already looking at a series of events that have been called terror events or terror attacks. We've seen events in New York City, New Orleans, and not to be missing out, Las Vegas, which is an interesting subject because many of us are going to be there in the coming month as SHOT Show approaches. But let's get on to the subject. See, we're talking about everyday carry, whether it comes to firearms or sharp objects or tools that we use on a daily basis. And while it seems like most of, let's call public opinion within the gun culture is solidified around a certain couple rules, I'm going to not necessarily challenge those, but try to reframe how we approach it so as to not just give you some sort of urgency candy so that you'll burn out before making any meaningful progress. Now that word salad of an introduction is over, this episode is sponsored by none other than Obsidian Arms. Now, Obsidian Arms they make their own components that can give you a critical advantage in some places like a competition field, or you can design some products through them. But they also sell a series of tools, namely a series of punch and tool kits that are either tool specific, firearm specific, or they are general use. So whether you are trying to expand your self-sufficiency within the gun culture, or you are trying to outfit something that you've acquired recently to give you a little bit more, a plus one, so to speak, then go ahead and check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Now, I started this episode with a little bit of a frustration of my own. It's that the way that we talk about EDC is so oftentimes this kind of lecturing endlessness. You go onto social media and someone says, if you don't have X, you're going to die. If you don't do X, you're going to die. If you don't carry this, blah, 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 blah. It can range as specific, or it can range as maybe attacking as if you don't carry one in the chamber. We're not going to address that on this episode, by the way. Or if you don't have a entire IFAK strapped to the inside of your thigh, like Miss Congeniality. I don't think I've seen the movie, so that's just a reference. But if you're going to, if you don't have all of these things, you might have a firearm, but do you have, an entire med kit or a night vision or a suppressor or blah, 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 blah. I mean, these are hyperbolic examples, but the tone is always exasperating because it oftentimes, again, comes across as this lecturing mentality. Oh, well, if you don't have this, you're going to die in the streets. And that might serve as some motivation for some, but for, I think, the great majority of us, it just kind of turns into another thing to start a fight about, another topic to debate over, another opportunity to grandstand about our great ideas and our great ideals about how so prepared we are for the future. Don't have 7 types of a fire starter, then you're gonna die in the woods. Instead of saying, well, here's some things that have been beneficial in my arena or in my life and something that I can help out here, or maybe some different ways to think about it. Now, one of the things that I think EDC or an everyday carry, not even mindset, mentality, worldview, but just the way that we look at it should be scalable. And I don't mean scalable in the sense that you have your everyday carry pistol on your belt with a PCC and a backpack carry and a complete long gun or carbine in the trunk of your car. Rather, it's not even that we need a battle belt here or a range belt here or a plate carrier everywhere we go, but it's that what we want to strive for is that we have the ability to scale up and scale down in accordance to the situation. One of the key examples that has stood out in my own life would be looking at the events around the 2020 Summer of Love. And there were times where in the different positions or places that I had been at, being much more overt about our readiness was an advantage, but more often than not, it was a disadvantage. We wanted to scale down, blend in, look inconspicuous so as to get from here to there or accomplish the tasks that we had before us with minimal resistance. It's not to mistake the idea of the fight that you don't have to engage in is the one you're always going to win as some sort of universal moral imperative. Sometimes the right answer is to, in another gun culture phrase, stand your ground, do what needs to be done with the situation that you've been handed. But what I mean by scalable is that what is another adage of sorts, or adage, however you pronounce it, that is, you don't want to be doing something for the first time when your life depends on it. In the military, someone would say you don't want to do this for the first time in combat. And there are a number of items, and I've done the cringeworthy listicle of sorts with this episode on a number of things that have stood out over the last decade that have contributed to different EDC capabilities or everyday carry options throughout time to vary one way or another with circumstance. And so there are I kind of think of everyday carry items as something that exists in categories. So once again, we're talking about, in recent events, we've had the vehicle attack in New Orleans, where somebody used a truck to drive into a series of, people on the street, killing at least, what was the last report, 15, and going on and dying in a gunfight. There was also there was a shooting in a I believe a nightclub in New York, but the vehicle attack is something that we've seen if we get outside of the American perspective multiple times. And in a conversation that I was having with a friend recently, one of the things that stood out about the Cybertruck explosion outside of the Trump Tower in Las Vegas is that it wasn't exactly an effective vehicle-borne IED or VBID. And it seems like Americans' understanding and understanding of explosives ranges from the catastrophic, like the Oklahoma City bombing, to the comical, like the improper use of tannerite, which is really not exclusive to the United States, but it tends to find its home there. And so events might serve as a reminder to refresh what we're at, but they are not alone enough motivation to carry us through to the end goal, which is scalability. And so what are the three categories that I want to address? One of them are things that we pretty much always want to be able to have, or we would consider it a disadvantage if we're not able to carry. That's a double-sided argument. It's something that we pretty much always carry on ourselves, or we consider situations where we're not able to carry those things less than common. They're ones that we might need to make alterations for. And so these are things like, for many Americans, it's a handgun. It might be a pocket knife. It might be, maybe for some of us a flashlight, but we'll get to that later. Wallet, watch, keys, phone, maybe sunglasses, hat. These are kind of the things that you carry on an everyday basis. I mean, almost everybody that I know every day carries at least some form of pantaloons and shoes, but those don't make the list. And so we would say most of the EDC things that we're very common with, again, a handgun, a pistol, maybe oftentimes a pocket knife or some sort of utility tool in that sense. This is something that most of us pretty much do carry every day. I mean, you can point out vet bros, not to be too derogatory. But then there are oftentimes things that we want, but we don't carry all the time. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of these in the near future. And then there are things that require skill that we would want to be able to carry, or maybe we do, but we have to recognize that without a certain level of skill around them, they're not as useful as we want them to be. So I'm going to start with another story, another example. In 2013, I was on a cross-country motorcycle trip riding a 1975/76 Honda Goldwing. And a couple days into my journey, so to speak, I ended up getting hit by a car. And the result of that was I was injured, but not gravely. And after this sort of shock of the event, I had an injury. It wasn't life-threatening, thankfully, but it could have been. But what ended up happening is I basically couldn't move. I was crippled, not necessarily crippled, but pretty much on the ground, and recognized that there was bleeding going on. And so there was another person at the scene, and I was trying to explain to them to go to my motorcycle and get the item, the IFAK, the first aid kit, on the top of the pouch of the rucksack that was at the back of the bike. He ended up coming with like a blanket. Well, it was a sleeping bag. Not exactly what I was looking for. And so one of the things that kind of revealed was when we think about EDC, it doesn't exclusively mean what's on our body, but it should be something that we can find with even when we are discombobulated, or we can hopefully give directions to somebody who doesn't exactly know what they're looking for. Not everybody on the side of the road is your enemy. Not everybody out there is out there to get you. So what I learned from that experience was that I had a first aid kit. I had a tourniquet. I had, in the event that it was going to be worse, it would have been much worse. But I had something with me, but it was too obscure to find by anybody other than myself. And so the first item I think when we're talking about scalability should be a spare magazine. Now, I don't know if many of us really carry a second magazine all the time. But this is where that adage I was referencing to earlier comes into play. If I'm in a situation, or let's say we're not necessarily in civil unrest writ large, but we're approaching that teetering collapse or that teetering experience rather quickly, I don't want the first time that I decide to carry a spare magazine to be when I am under duress. And that means if you're going to think about, you may not carry a second spare magazine or a spare magazine with you all the time, but you should at least know how you're going to do it if you're going to do it. Now, there are a number of tools, whether it's holsters that include a sidecar kind of concept, or there are other kind of pocket clip carry concepts that are available out there. Some of them I think are quite admirable, but just because I don't regularly carry a second magazine doesn't mean that I shouldn't know how I'm going to do it. Now, we might say throw it in a pocket. That is an option for some people, not for everybody. We might say throw it in some sort of off-body carry, like a sling bag like this. But the point is, and the illustration I'm trying to make here, is that most of us who carry a firearm have more than one magazine for said firearm. And we may not often or rarely ever carry a spare mag, but I think that it's worth adding that scalability to what you do carry in the event that you think that that would be appropriate for the situation. This is a never want to do this for the first time in combat. So if you're going to carry a spare magazine in any capacity, you want to know how you're going to draw it, how that's going to affect your carry, what's going to be in what pocket, and so long and so forth. The second thing is a topic that has kind of come up and died down and come up and died down. And it's another one of those really rough kind of lecture-y subjects that gets talked about not necessarily often, but just enough to be sort of frustrating up until what I think is quite recently, which is carrying some form of a tourniquet. Now, this ETQ by Snake Staff Systems, say that 10 times fast, is a neat, very small, carryable tourniquet that in the event that you're in something like a car crash or motorcycle accident, there's somebody on the side of the road who has that imminent danger of massive hemorrhaging. Now you have a tool to solve it. I tend to carry one in this small bag with me at all times, at least one, because they really are quite small. They're about the size of this is a SIG P365 magazine, SIG P365X macro magazine. So they're not very hard to carry anymore. And I think that there's something that I think they are or have quickly become something that's really easy to take with you somewhere. There are different ways that you can carry it, whether it's in, again, some sort of sidecar concept, or I believe it is our friends at Gorilla Tactical that make kind of a inside the belt clip carry solution, which I have been using for a while, even though it's not always on my body. So these small tourniquets go a long ways, and I have been in situations where I'm very thankful that I had them, even though I didn't need them, because the level of injury was not high enough that they were necessary, but they could have been. And so one is, if you're going to carry a spare magazine, or if you carry a firearm, you might want to be able to carry a spare magazine. If you're going to carry a spare magazine, you don't want to do it the first time under duress. The second one is a tourniquet. Now, a tourniquet is, none of these should sound all that exciting or surprising, because you've probably heard someone talk about it before. But with this ETQ by Snake Staff Systems and the carrying system, the sled by Gorilla Tactical, there are new ways to give it a shot. It's pretty easy to tuck and hide somewhere in case you need it. Don't make a joke out of that. Or if you have to, leave it in the comment below. But hey, remember, I got to read that. So now the third one. Now those two are, neither of them are something that we always want. They are, well, the tourniquet getting closer to something that we might always want, especially with the types of attacks or potential dangers that we might face out in the world. Remember, car accidents happen pretty often. But the third one is something that requires skill, and that would be a set of lockpicks. Now you can go over to, Cloaked Entry Co., and you can see plenty of material on that. I've had this little kit for a long time with me, and there have been scenarios where not only did I have to learn how to use them a little bit on the fly, but they were really handy to get into something that we were legally allowed to, but somehow locked out. If you've ever locked yourself out of your own house or your own apartment, they might help. But the point on these types of items, or a set of lockpicks, is that they're a skill that we kind of intuitively from the video game world know that they have a intrinsic value to us getting somewhere, but they're not something that we just carry in our pockets. Another version of something like that would be the Flipper Zero. Now, this one was ruined in a different motorcycle accident, not to create a pattern of life here. But the Flipper is something that does give the individual an array of not only awareness to their own vulnerabilities, which with how signals can be used to track and disrupt our daily lives, but also how we might be more vulnerable than we think we are. But I think the first warning that should come with a Flipper is it's not pick up and go. It's not like you can pick it up and become a master hacker. It takes a little bit of familiarization, but that familiarization is in its own beautiful way a gamification of learning. And so the third thing that we might want to consider adding to our a EDC or a scalable EDC would be something like a set of lockpicks or a flipper. If you're more technologically inclined, the flipper is going to probably be right up your alley. But the thing about lockpicks is that you don't just pick them up and know how to use them. They take a little bit of, like riding a bike, the feeling as opposed to just knowing how it works. I can explain to you how a set of lockpicks can be used to get access to something that you need to, but I can't explain that feeling. Now, I'm no master of the tools, but this is something that when we want to add to EDC, we can talk about skill-related items. And when we want to talk about something that we might carry on a mostly daily basis, these are ones that I think in their own right are just as much a teaching tool as they are a skill development, something to add a skill set of sorts. So the more that we learn about how locking mechanisms work through a lockpick, the more we can understand our vulnerabilities and see the world in a slightly different angle as we have more ways to get into more places. The same thing goes in with the flipper. The more that we understand how the world of signals works, the more we're going to be aware of how it can be used to track us and how we can use it to better maneuver the world. Now, the fourth thing on this list is something that has been perhaps the most useful over the last couple of years. Well, longer than that. And that is something as simple as pen and paper. Now, our phones are really good for taking notes. You can use your phone to take video and audio recordings of things that you need to remember, or passwords and captions and things like that. But a pen and paper is really useful for more than just one thing. One, you can take notes, and if you bring something like a lighter, you can dispose of them. But also, when you deal with language barriers, even with people who speak the same language, a notebook can be very helpful for illustrating something that you need to do. Maybe you need to draw out a route, give somebody a map, identify information that's going to be helpful for them and for you. And a pen and paper is something that is, as an EDC item, is rather simple. And you can get these little Moleskine notebooks, and you can get the little G2 pens or whatever you want to carry. And while they don't fit in every pocket at all the time, they continue to be useful in the broadest sense. Now, we're going to talk about that scalability again. I want to be able to have things that are the least conspicuous and the most helpful. Lockpicks are going to be of the things that we've talked about so far, lockpicks are going to probably be the most conspicuous, but the least helpful in many circumstances. But in the most specific ones, perhaps the more cerebral ones, they can take you quite a ways. But a pen and paper is the opposite end of that spectrum. Having a pen and paper is not going to make you look like a journalist. Maybe that's what you think it is, but it's going to give you just something else to communicate in a world, whether it's a language barrier and you're traveling abroad, or in your own environment to make, say, rally point times or communication strategies or radio frequencies, which we'll kind of talk about that in a second. So we've covered so far. What are the ways that we should think about EDC is that we want it to be scalable. And what I mean by scalable is not so much that we can move from one level of intensity to another, but that we are able to tailor what we carry with us out the door to the potential needs of our circumstances. This leads to something that I think could be a little bit more anecdotal, but one of them is going to be your environment. I live in the desert right now. I used to live in a very cold environment. It was normal in the cold environment to keep spare clothing and blankets in your car. Here, where I'm at in the desert, you should keep water in your vehicle. Now, it can get hot in the summer, but the cold months oftentimes are much more dry than we are expecting them to be. And so, just like we might envision some scenario where we have to get back to home, get back to the base, bug out, whatever, keeping a bottle of water in the car goes a long way. Or being able to have access to water. Gas stations are not reliable in this sense. You might be in a neighborhood where they get looted frequently. You might be in a neighborhood where when you want that water, you don't have it. And so water, or environmentally appropriate clothing in your vehicle is a pretty easy thing to keep around. A blanket, a poncho, a whoopee. And so a jacket, gloves, a hat. These things are useful to be kept in your vehicle as we're thinking about that scalability in the things that we normally participate in our lives, not as some nuanced, specific disaster scenario that we have envisioned in our head. Another option would be something like a lighter. Now, a lighter, for those, smoking isn't as common as it used to be before, but a lighter can be the perfect conversation starter, and it can be another conversation closer. Being able to distract and send somebody off, they're bothering you, they're pestering you, you give them the lighter, whatever, or they ask for a light, you can now pry them for information. A Bic lighter doesn't really cost you much, and then if you're in a cold environment that you get separated from, let's say, polite society, at least you have one type of a fire starting tool. But a lighter is inconspicuous, and they're $2, $2.50, $2.59, I don't remember. But finally, for the last one that is possibly the most timeline specific, we live in an age of increasing surveillance. We've seen high-profile events like Antifa marching through streets, or the person who assassinated Brian Thompson. And that isn't so much to talk about how these things are used for crimes, but as we endure more and more surveillance, having some way to obscure your face really isn't as unusual as it used to be. It might be like a neck gaiter, something that's used to keep your neck warm in a cold environment, something to keep the sun off your face in a hot environment. But if you keep them in something like this, it doesn't really speak the same thing as being up to mischief. The last one would be an alternative mode of communication. And if you want to go down that route, I highly recommend you check out Gridbasedotnet. He's been on the show before. Jake Knight has done quite a bit for our community, or the broader culture and community, in making radios and off-grid communications more accessible. Now, in closing, you can take this a long way and send yourself down a rabbit hole with no reasonable conclusion. But what I wanted to do is pull back not necessarily the veil, but the way that we talk about an everyday carry, and instead of looking at it as something that is used to shame or even grandstand about our own intelligence or whatever, rather it's something that, when we think about scalability, is something that we want to be at least moderately comfortable with in the event that we want to add something or take something away. If we need to add, say, a fixed blade knife or a radio to our vehicle, or if we wanted to add a tourniquet, the first time that we have to do that shouldn't be under duress. And while we never know when that time will happen, we know that it does happen, and we don't want to be the victim. We don't want to be the person in that situation that wishes that we had taken the small amount of preparation in order to be capable in the long run. If this has been beneficial, thank you for listening. This is the Redacted Culture Cast, currently sponsored by Obsidian Arms, and we will see you soon. If you're going to be at SHOT Show, we'll see you there. Now go forth and conquer.